But if you come into this endeavor only seeking single causal explanations to explain everything, then you're never going to get anywhere.
You're going to have a bad time.
You're gonna have a bad time. Well, one needs a healthy ego these days to make it in the world, you know?
Here's a question. Do you find that your ego expands and contracts throughout the year? Because I totally do, in the sense that there are periods in my life where I'm feeling great and I'm just feeling top of my game, and I can feel that I'm just feeling more arrogant or something. And then I actively have to notice that and dampen that shit down. And then other periods of my life, stuff goes poorly, I fuck up something, I'm just not on my game, and then I just feel more insecure, and I feel my ego contracts a little bit. Does that experience land with you at all?
I think it's probably not even parts of the year for most people, me included. I think it's probably day by day, hour by hour, just different social contexts bring about different amounts of ego with it, depending on whether you feel really comfortable in your environment and comfortable with what you're doing, like the top dog in your field or something, and then but maybe you're slightly socially awkward and then you go to bars and try and talk to girls and your ego severely diminishes or something.
My ego plummets as soon as I try to do that, for sure. Yeah.
But in that sense, it's sort of the same thing as confidence, I guess. Your confidence definitely fluctuates depending on your aptitude for whatever situation you're in. By ego, I guess, do you mean the sense that you are really good at whatever you're doing, or just your sense of grandiosity in the moment, or your sense of self is inflated somehow? You feel like you're very central and pivotal and important to whatever's going on, versus sometimes you don't, because I rarely feel like I'm important to whatever's going on.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, the difference between confidence and ego. Yeah, definitely my confidence will fluctuate within the hour, just depending on how my day is going. But I guess by ego, I was trying to identify something that is a bit longer lasting.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I'll fuck up something at work, or I will just blow a conversation, or I will most recently get too emotional in private debates with close friends of mine, and then need to send an apology text message because I overstepped. And then when something like that happens, then it takes me a month or so of okay, I totally screwed up here. And that almost affects my confidence before a social interaction. It's a multi-week thing, or month thing. And noticing that about myself has been useful, because I never want to be arrogant, and ego is not an attractive feature of personality. And so when I notice myself starting to get a bit inflated, maybe a positive YouTube comment, or maybe just some compliment I receive lands more deeply than I would like it to, I'm starting to notice oh, okay, ego inflation period, and I just am hyper aware of that, and recognize it's transient, and recognize that when I'm feeling down, I should remember the higher ego moments as a way to kind of stabilize, I guess, because I don't want it to be inflated beyond my control, nor deflated beyond my control. And recognizing it can kind of come in cycles has been a useful way to quell the peaks and soften the troughs, I guess.
Yeah, I've actually heard hardcore meditators talk about this in a fairly extreme context, where a lot of people will start meditating for the positive psychological benefits it brings you, right? A lot of people are walking around with a lot of pain and anxiety under the surface all day, and people meditate as a way to try and regulate and recognize those emotions so they can deal with them or try and banish them or whatever. But once you're in this state where you've been meditating a lot and you're realizing that thoughts are just coming and going, and you're able to sort of just, recognize them and then let them flit away and sort of let them have less of a long-term impact on your emotions or your psychological state. Then I've heard a byproduct of that is that, of course, this also happens with positive emotions.
Exactly.
Right? So you might start meditating with the goal of getting rid of fear, shame, and anxiety. But then, of course, you realize that, yeah, exactly as you said, someone pays you a compliment at a party, and you realize, like, okay, that sort of just bounces off you as well. Like, okay, can you really take credit for that? And there's even some interesting interactions with free will and stuff here, right? Where if you're ready to let go of like many of your regrets and stuff in the past because you sort of are convinced that there was no real other option for you, right? There was no you that could have really done otherwise in that moment. Then you start realizing the same thing with respect to all the good things you've done in your life. Like, you can't take credit for all the hard work you've put in to achieve something, or that brilliant idea you had that resulted in some cool paper or some cool blog post. And so there's this symmetry with respect to like emotional regulation where you also then like can't take credit for the good things. And I think that probably is good overall, right? Because I think I think that's sort of just objectively true in the sense that people are probably too attached to both negative and positive emotions. And so ego should just be dampened across the board. But yeah, it is this interesting consequence of, yeah, both things like meditation and also just discussions of free will and stuff that sort of like down regulates your happy moments as well. Whereas like a priori you might want that you could sort of up-regulate your bad your bad emotional states but then keep all the super happy like pleasant, proud, egotistical moments, because those feel quite good. But in fact, I think you can't really do that. So yeah, I think I totally understand what you're saying, both personally, and then I think there's sort of a reason for it too, because I think once you're more in contact with your emotions and you're just recognizing thoughts as thoughts and emotions as emotions and things that you can't necessarily control, then there's just this byproduct where, of course, it's going to happen with any sort of valenced emotion, whether that valence is positive or negative.
And it's like if you or I have a period of like depression or anxiety or negative ruminations, we will intentionally go out of our way, or at least I will, and I'm sure you will have something similar, to try to regulate that, to meditate, to recognize that these negative emotions are not maybe an accurate reflection of reality, and we take measures. It's just less common to do that with positive emotions, and arguably you don't necessarily want to do that with like happiness and stuff. But emotions like ego, which can feel good, but can lead you to act in a way that you are going to regret later, as has happened to me many times, is something I'm now trying to regulate as well, which is just the recognition that me feeling super great about myself, like right now, is that's going to go away soon. And I shouldn't act on it, and I should just be fucking damn humble to recognize that, like, in the same way that if I'm negatively ruminating on all my failures, that's not an accurate reflection of reality. If I'm like positively ruminating on all my successes, that too is not a accurate reflection of reality. And so just this idea that like one should expect one's ego to kind of expand and contract throughout the year has been a useful kind of like reminder that when I'm feeling pretty good at myself, like positive, that like, you're probably just in a like expansive moment, and maybe don't act any differently than you would when you are in a contractive moment, because if you go around acting like a dick, then like your ego may blind you to that fact, right? And like you meet people who have huge egos, and like they're not the greatest people to be around, but I just want to like remember that when my ego is like contracted, because that too is transient. And so it's just been this little thing I've been observing about myself over the last couple years.
It's funny because it's got this like self-reinforcing property whereby if you recognize that about yourself, then you'll probably take more care in social situations, be a more fun person to be around. Then that itself can boost your ego. Like, oh, I have constrained my ego. I'm such a nice person. But if you do successfully do that all the time and realize that at any moment you could fuck up and fall back into humility, then it does have this positive externality where like you probably are more interesting and fun to be around. And so it's sort of that itself then should boost its ego. And now you have to make this double effort to reel that in. And
There's another kind of interesting parallel to like the meditation thing, which is I haven't like reached what do you call the state where you lose the self?
Just ego death, I guess.
nice connection. I wasn't thinking about that word, but
in the drug context, I guess. But yeah.
No, there's a term that Sam uses that like the final destination of like meditation is to just have the center drop out, and you don't even view yourself as like moving through the world. You just kind of see the world. You lose the illusion of being like a person behind your eyes, and is just like raw experience and stuff. There's a word for that. It's blanking. But the two that you used are close enough. But there's something interesting about just that concept of like, stop thinking about yourself. Like, you aren't the most important thing. Just get yourself out of your own minds and just think about the world. That can be a powerful thing too, which is like, you're at a party and you're thinking about your own ego right now. You should be thinking about what the other person is saying. Like, you shouldn't even be thinking about yourself. You should be thinking about what you're hearing, what's going on around you, and just drop yourself out of your own thought process as much as you can, just to purely focus on what the other person is saying, how you can contribute to the conversation, how you can just make the environment more fun. But like, you shouldn't be thinking about yourself really at all, both in the positive or the negative sense. And so when I catch myself thinking about myself, I'm trying to like stop doing that. And it's happens occasionally and stuff, but just an interesting similarity with this like losing the sense of self, I guess, as like an endpoint destination, both in meditation, but also just in like being a nicer person to be around or whatever.
And I think, if you're less focused on yourself, I think you will end up being happier, funnily enough. And I think there is this sort of awkward phenomenon where depressed people tend to be very self-centered. And this isn't to blame them. Like, I'm very much aware that, depression is out of a lot of people's control and there's external factors and stuff. But it just does seem to be a fact that to be depressed is sort of a state where you're just constantly ruminating about how like your relationship to the world and how your mind relates to the world. And David Foster Wallace has this short story called The Depressed Person, where it takes you on this journey as a reader inside the mind of a depressed person. And it's extremely uncomfortable because you as the reader feel very annoyed with being inside this person's head, because it's just all about them, and like every interaction they observe is like some reflection onto them. And it's not always a good reflection. It's clear that to be in this person's head is not happy. Like, you don't wish this on this person, but it's still this awkward fact that you like you actively dislike this depressed person. But anyway, so there is this sort of awkward thing where being too self-obsessed leads to depression. And vice versa. And so to like get out of your own head as much as possible is also just, brings about psychological benefits as well. Anyway, I don't know what to make of any of this, but it's just one random thought that came to mind. So do with that what you will, I guess.
Well, it connects well to the subject of anxiety, depression, suicide, and social media. Let's grab a drink and dive into part 2 of Mr. Jonathan Haidt's Anxious Generation.
Sometimes we have to postpone the episodes just because Vaden's like, all right, don't have a nickname yet. Yeah, we have all this great content, but I need another week to come up with a nickname. So
okay, let me just do the whole thing again. My name is Vaden Masrani, Senior Research Scientist in Machine Learning, and we have Mr. the champion himself, the air conditioner to my to my climate change. I thought that was going to be funny. Mr. Benjamin Benneth Benedict Bonaparte Chugg the First.
These things are just getting longer and longer. In a couple of months, it's going to be half the episode is going to be working up to my introduction. That's my worst nightmare.
How funny would a middle name be if you just shoved all permutations of the person's first name into the middle name?
And then you have to say it seriously at customs.
Yeah, exactly. Hi, I'm Benjamin Benneth Benedict Bonaparte Chugg the First. Okay, I'll stop amusing myself. That was a good one. I love that one. So we are on Patreon, on Discord. Send us an email to get into the Discord. We're on YouTube. Our YouTube views are not what they should be. It's probably our fault. Please click on them. Just drive those numbers up. Share them widely. You don't have to watch it. Just click it. Just set it on repeat. And just
leave it on in the background.
Yeah, just leave it on in the background. You're fine. Don't even pay. Just get the numbers up, people. Today we're kind of doing a follow-up episode on Mr. Jonathan Haidt. We had some listener feedback. Some friends were asking us to go into a few different areas that we haven't talked about. And so largely the things we'll talk about today are what's actually going on with the data. So in the last episode, just to kind of set the stage a bit, we had said that, yes, there's a real effect here with the number of hospital admissions due to self-harm kind of trending upwards, both in the United States and the UK, although we didn't see it in places like Canada, Australia, or France, where I looked into that. And we talked about Haidt's hypothesis, which is it's due to social media, and kind of talked about reasons why that doesn't seem plausible. So if you haven't listened to that episode first, definitely do that. But we didn't actually explain what is an alternative hypothesis. So we're going to talk about that. We were asked to talk a bit about cyberbullying, which was also an extensive discussion in Haidt's book that we didn't go into. And cyberbullying, I thought he actually did a really nice job. And so there's some criticisms I have of how that's positioned within the larger thesis he's making, but we want to talk about cyberbullying. And then last, just more generally, what are some things about his book that we liked? Because there are some good parts in the book. We mainly were focused on the negatives, but we're going to go into the positives as well. So with that extended preamble, maybe we'll just pass it over to Mr. Benjamin Benedict Bonaparte the Chug the First.
This episode has a bit of a funny origin. We actually tried to record this episode last week at some point and realized we had quite starkly different opinions on what was going on, specifically about one of the theses, which is encapsulated in David Wallace Wells' New York Times opinion piece. And that thesis is basically that this is caused by changes in reporting standards vis-a-vis mental health. We thought we'd get into that. What happened is that we disagreed substantively enough that it just became a deep dive into research land. Obviously, we try and keep disagreements in the main episode for you guys because we think that is enlightening and fun. But for this one, it was just so data heavy that we realized halfway through that this was absolutely not going to make good listening. And so we kept it as an episode, but we made it Patreon only. So if you want to follow us into the weeds of that subject specifically, we're just going to direct you to our Patreon feed. And I think today, instead of sort of diving into the weeds there, I think we'll probably just summarize where we're both at with that thesis and then talk about some other angles on the book and some other theses.
Yeah, let me introduce the thesis and then also say how my mind has changed. So we definitely went into the Patreon conversation disagreeing, but I'm basically fully on Ben's side now. He's completely changed my mind with regards to the strength of the evidence for Walls's thesis. So let me set up a thesis and then kind of say where I was before that discussion and where I'm at now. So I'll just quote Walls. I did this in the Patreon, but I think it's a nice quote and a nice way to set up the subject, as well as kind of refresh listeners on what we covered in the previous episode. So this is from a 2024 opinion piece on the New York Times titled "Are Smartphones Driving Our Teens to Depression?" And I'm going to read the first two paragraphs. So the first paragraph summarizes Haidt's thesis. So here's a story. In 2007, Apple released the iPhone, initiating the smartphone revolution that would quickly transform the world. In 2010, it added a front-facing camera, helping shift the social media landscape towards images, especially selfies. Partly as a result, in the 5 years that followed, the nature of childhood, and especially adolescence, was fundamentally changed. A great rewiring, in the words of social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, such that between 2010 and 2015, mental health and well-being plummeted and suffering and despair exploded, particularly among teenage girls. So for women, rates of hospitalization for non-fatal self-harm in the United States, which had bottomed out in 2009, started to rise again, according to data reported to the CDC, taking a leap beginning in 2012 and another beginning in 2016, and producing, over about a decade, an alarming 48% increase in such emergency room visits among American teenage girls aged 15 to 19, and a shocking 188% increase among girls aged 2 to 4. Okay, so that's the first story. Let's call that the first explanation, the first hypothesis as to what is causing this rise in non-fatal self-harm incidents in the United States. So then Walls continues, and he says, here is another story. So in 2011, as part of the rollout of the Affordable Care Act, the Department of Health and Human Services, the HHS, issued a new set of guidelines that recommended that teenage girls should be screened annually for depression by their primary care physicians, and that same year required that insurance providers cover such screenings in full. Maybe just parenthetical comment here. So first thing that changed is that now the guidelines are that girls should be screened for depression. So more people are checking for depression, and also said screenings are covered. So they're not, you don't have to pay for them. That's the first change. Second change is that in 2015, the HHS finally mandated a coding change proposed by the World Health Organization almost 2 decades before that required hospitals to record whether an injury was self-inflicted or accidental, and which seemingly overnight doubled rates for self-harm across all demographic groups. So Ben had a nice discussion of this in the Patreon, which is, and correct me here, but previously you had to write 2 things down, like what are they here for and was it self-harm? But afterwards you just have to write 1 thing down. And if you have to write 2 things down, often the second thing just isn't written down because nurses and doctors are busy. So it's just harder to capture that information. But so switching it to a single marking is going to obviously increase the rates of self-harm. So, okay, so that's a really nice explanation as to why we see the data spikes going up. However, I went too far with it. So in the beginning of the last attempt at this episode, I basically said, okay, we have our explanation now. And that was what I was trying to argue. Ben rightly pointed out that I was succumbing to the fallacy of the single cause. And that if you assume that there's only one cause for this rise, and you look at the data that we had talked about last time, there are still unanswered questions there too. So I just want to summarize kind of how my mind has changed throughout that discussion, and then see if you agree with where I'm at and if we're on the same page now. So where I'm at and where I think our discussion led to is that, we can definitely say that there's let's say, strong causal evidence that this change in coding produced a noticeable spike in the United States. In particular, there is some papers written about like one hospital, and you look at one hospital before and after the change, and you just see like a. And then obviously these changes are going to be gradually rolled out. So that's fairly compelling that between 2010 and 2015, the coding change is a major contributor to the spike in teenage rates of self-harm. However, if it was just purely coding changes, that doesn't explain why in the States it continues to go up. So it went up past the coding change. And then there's just other things in the data that can't easily be explained by that too. So I came in pretty strongly out of the gate. Ben pointed out like, well, you can't explain this, you can't explain that. And so I cannot say that it's just this one thing that's caused the spike, but it definitely contributed. And there's certainly causal evidence to support the claim that this was a major contributor. So where I'm at now is that, we still can't say conclusively it was this one thing or this other thing, but the coding standards accounts for much more of the spike based on the causal evidence that we have than social media, but social media still probably accounts for some of it. We just don't really know how much. I'll end there and see if you agree with that summary and if there's some nuances that I've maybe missed.
No, yeah, I think that's basically right. I think it's clear that the coding changes produce some of the effect in the US, but many issues remain after that. There's a lot to say here, it turns out, but I think it's best to just point people towards our Patreon episode and just say that, basically where I'm at is I think this explains some of the trends in the US, but there's just tons more to explain after this.
Could you say more than the social media? I want to make some sort of opinionated statement that this gets us closer to understanding, but I'm just curious if you sign off on my other claim that there's more causal evidence for this hypothesis than the other hypothesis.
Yeah, I think as the literature stands right now, there's basically no causal evidence for social media. So if we're just going by like, what do we think the most robust studies in the literature are pointing to as causes here? I think coding changes are much more substantial and a much more robust cause than social media, which basically has, like we discussed last time, sort of very little good evidence backing it as a claim. Yeah, of course, there's all the issues that we mentioned in the first episode, that the effects of social media are often network level effects. And so it can be difficult here to study it as like a dose response model and stuff. So there's the difficulty of the subject matter, and who knows what the study tomorrow is going to turn up. But I think as it stands right now, you know, if you're focused on like the academic literature about this subject, then there's just very little backing for social media as a cause of this spike in anxiety and depression among teenage girls.
So you had done some more dives into other hypotheses, and so maybe that's a nice place to continue.
Yeah, nice. Another thesis that I will just briefly touch on that I've seen advanced is that school stress is a major cause of these depression and less than stellar mental health stats among adolescents. And Peter Gray is one of the main people who's advocated this. We talked about Peter Gray last time in the context of Haidt, and he sort of co-founded Let Grow and stuff with him. And so his claim is basically that Common Core, which was implemented in the US around 2010, 2012, as sort of the instantiation of the No Child Left Behind Act that was passed by Bush in 2008-ish, basically made school just extremely difficult on students and just like standardize everything across the board, increase their stress levels. And so now they're just burdened by homework and tests and stuff all the time. And it's just making their life miserable. His main source of evidence here is just suicide rates. So you just look at suicide rates, and they've been increasing among adolescents over time. And in particular, they're much, much lower during the summer and when students are at home than they are during the school year. So they spike during the school year, sort of in the middle of the school year, and then fall during the summer. Okay, so there's quite a bit to say here.
Before you go on, just two small clarifying questions. So the No Child Left Behind Act was passed by Bush in like the early 2000s, and the main idea was to try to raise students' grades by providing or withholding funding to schools which don't meet certain standardized testing criteria. And then what is Common Core? Is Common Core like the curriculum by which they are measuring the improved education of students? Is that right?
Yeah, it's the actual set of standards that are adopted by each school.
Okay. And so the idea is that Bush's policy stressed teachers out, made them realize that they could, kind of exaggerating here just for pedagogical reasons, made them realize that they could lose funding, like the principals would lose funding for their school if the kids' grades didn't go up. And so it just like increased the intensity of education everywhere, causing stress, causing people to then kill themselves. That's like the gross simplified story that's being told in this telling. Okay, great.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there are a couple things this story can account for. One, again, this gets us back to cross-country data. So I think, Common Core, this is a US phenomenon, and you can find some other studies that are claiming that school has gotten more difficult for students in like Sweden and Denmark. But what are the odds school got like much more difficult across all of these countries simultaneously, such that suicide rates are increasing? That seems somewhat unlikely. Also, this doesn't account for why suicide rates among all age groups have been increasing in the US. Right. So you'd expect this to just be among kids if this was sort of the sole cause. Finally, I think you would expect that suicide rates are basically constant in the summer. So they should be about the same each summer and then increasing each school year. Right. But so even though you have this sort of sinusoidal wave with the trough at each summer and then the peak during when kids are actually in school, that wave itself still has a steady trend upwards, right? So there's still more suicides each summer fairly consistently. And I think this thesis basically can explain that. So again, this is sort of another explanation that's very US centric and probably does explain some of the rise in anxiety and self-harm rates and suicide rates, etc., among students in the US, but certainly just can't be used as a broad thesis to capture what's going on at like a global level, insofar as we think that there are trends at a global level here.
I just think this is an interesting example of how easy it is to tell post hoc stories to explain data, and how difficult it is to find single underlying causes, and how tempting it is for researchers, myself included, to think they found one perfect single explanation to explain the thing, when really there's not one easy explanation here. And that I think is a weakness of Deutsch and a weakness of continuously, as I do, using physics examples to talk about explanations, because physics is unique in that you can often, and you're searching for one true theory of reality. But when you're dealing with like messy real world aggregate statistics all across the globe, and there are trends, but there's counter trends, and there's many different underlying forces and stuff. And you're presented with a simplified explanation as to what's happening, as I was with the coding rates. And I fell into this trap. I am not exempt from this critique. The mind just wants to find one answer, and it's hard to do that. And one has to train oneself continuously to resist that temptation. And so I just like the coverage here of the different hypotheses. We could talk about some evidence for and against different theories and different hypotheses and leading ones and stuff, but this is an example of there is no one best explanation. It's going to be different regions are going to have different mixtures of different kinds of explanations and things, and we can only really get an approximate kind of understanding of what's happening. And this is one of the dangers of using physics examples all the time. And so I just think this was a great learning opportunity for me, because I know about the fallacy of the single cause, and I freaking succumb to it anyway. And so when you pointed that out, that was like, fuck, yeah, you're right. I did that. You're right. And that kind of just like pulled me up out of my little rabbit hole of thinking I'd figured it out. And so it was a very useful corrective. And so just a good lesson for myself and the listener, that you will often be presented with very simple, neat, tight explanations to explain data. And then you go and look at the data and it doesn't really totally fit. And then it's just like messy and stuff. And so resist all easy explanations for complex stuff is I think, a good takeaway here.
Yeah. I mean, this also poses some problems or at least some demands that we be a little more nuanced about what we mean by something like falsification when we're dealing with this complex sociological phenomenon, right? Because when you're looking to not explain a trend in its entirety, when you're looking to explain part of a trend or some of the variance that goes along with something, then talking about data that doesn't quite fit your explanation is not a reason to necessarily toss that explanation entirely. You might just have to reduce the amount that can be explained by that, the amount of variance in your data that can be explained by that. And so it is a place where Popper might be accused here of being slightly naive with, and there's a reason, like when people discuss falsification, as you said, they tend to lean on examples, very clean examples from the sciences, right? But then in the social sciences, we're just in this gross heterogeneous world where there's like everything is a multi-factor cause, and people are susceptible to things to more and less degrees, and we're looking at averages, not individuals, and it just makes figuring out what is causing certain effects to be extremely difficult.
On the comment of falsification, Sean Carroll was particularly terrible on this subject. I forgot which podcast he talked about, but he has a whole paper about how Popper's is completely wrong and naive about falsification because you can't neatly falsify stuff in reality. But Sean Carroll's missing like the attitude component, the attitude of wanting to have your ideas falsified. So, I was falsified in the Patreon chat in the sense that I was coming out with a strong claim and you successfully argued me out of that claim. That is falsification at the level that Popper's thinking about it, at the fundamental level of an attitude. And so my claim was wrong. I was falsified. Does that mean that you can't falsify things in this domain? Well, it depends on what level you're talking about falsification. Like maybe an example would be like causality with a pool ball, white ball hitting the black ball, except the table's kind of tipped and there's an earthquake. So there's not just a single cause now. There's like the cue, and there's like the table tilt, and there's the earthquake. And it's really hard to think about every single contributing factor to this, but you can still falsify ideas like it's only the pool cue. It's a cue, right? That hits it's a stick. So there are definitely things that can be falsified in that domain, even if tracing the underlying true single or multi set of causes is a challenging problem. So yeah,
nice. And I mean, moreover, in that example, there is a correct answer to the question, how much of the pool ball's movement was caused by the cue and how much was caused by the tilt of the table, right? Yeah. And so you can answer that, and to map that back onto this example, this would be saying, okay, how much of the increase is caused by social media, how much is caused by coding changes, how much is caused by changing school standards, right? And there are right and wrong answers to those questions. It's just that you have to ask those questions at the right level of resolution, like you were saying, for them to be falsified. But if you come into this endeavor only seeking single causal explanations to explain everything, then you're never going to get anywhere.
You're going to have a bad time.
You're gonna have a bad time. Nice. So so I started thinking about what I might think about this issue if you had just shown me the data on, say, increasing self-harm rates, and I hadn't seen any other hypotheses for what's going on here. And I started to think about what sort of cultural changes happened around early 2010s. And I realized quite a lot of stuff happened. And quite a lot of stuff that might be put under the umbrella of apocalypticism, or just maybe cultural pessimism is a better term. And now I'm curious if I'm doing exactly what we were saying earlier, of like anchoring too heavily, or like, doing some post hoc analysis of past stuff, or if I can maybe convince you that early 2010s actually were sort of a unique cultural moment, or like in that, even the decade of the 2010s has been sort of a unique cultural moment as it relates to people's pessimism about the future.
So a fourth hypothesis enters the fray, is what you're saying. Give us that fresh take.
Potentially a fourth hypothesis, but let me just say right up front, I think this hypothesis doesn't explain why the rise has been particularly prominent among adolescent girls in particular. I think you could make a case why it's affected adolescents more, but I think we seem to see like self-harm rates really rising among adolescent girls more than boys, and I think this can't explain that. But I think there might be actually something interesting going on here.
Awesome.
So let me just outline a couple things that I think happened, and then we can dive more into the details as necessary. So one, I think we really started to see fear about climate change. So and in particular, we had movements that were basically like environmental apocalyptic style movements. So, this started in sort of like mid 2000s with An Inconvenient Truth, sort of came out in 2006, Al Gore's documentary. But then late 2000, 2008, 2009, and then early 2010s, we saw a bunch of climate change orgs emerge that were focused on like degrowth, saying that we're doomed if we don't do stuff, we don't keep the warming under some level, we only have 5 more years and stuff. So we saw like 350.org, Climate Change Reality Project, Earth Guardians, Deep Green Resistance, Climate Justice Action, and then a little bit later we saw like Extinction Rebellion and like Greta Thunberg stuff, and that was sort of later 2010s. But that whole like sort of movement, I think, started late 2000s, early 2010s. Then there was a general fear about like the economy and the future of wealth and stuff, right? Obviously, 2008 financial crisis sort of kickstarted this. And then we saw like that cascade into the Eurozone debt crisis, which had a huge impact in Europe. And then there were social movements that arose out of that. So you had like Occupy Wall Street, especially, right, came out of that, which is basically people just saying that we need to change the global financial system because it's rigged and it's not helping the median household, and the elites are sort of being irresponsible with our money. And you might even classify like Yellow Vest movement and stuff like that, and that sort of, I don't want to say a populist movement, so sort of like a revolt by sort of just like ordinary workers against what they saw as unfair treatment by the elites. And so I think this stuff sort of cascaded into some more general global issues. So we had like the Arab Spring in Tunisia in 2011, right? We had the rise of ISIS in like 2013. We had the Syrian civil war, which kicked off a huge refugee crisis, which has obviously changed the political landscape pretty drastically in Europe. Then we also had like AI and techno fear come about sort of like 2013, 2014-ish. And because it was like easy to ignore neural networks and stuff until they actually started working, right? And so like AlexNet started working like 2012, 2014 was GANs, 2015 ResNet, etc. And then Bostrom wrote superintelligence in 2014. And I think that really put like AI fear and stuff on the map. And then finally, there was this sense that I guess is coupled a bit again with like Occupy Wall Street and stuff, which was just this sense that like systems were failing and there was corruption among government and elites and stuff. So there was like the WikiLeaks, Panama Papers and stuff. There were the Snowden revelations. And then there was also just certain events like things stopped working. So we had like the Fukushima thing, which just freaked people out, right? And it was just like, okay, the world energy systems are coming apart. And we also had like early 2010s, there's a lot of there's like a peak in oil prices, right? And so there was a lot of narratives around like peak oil and energy collapse at that point. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is there was a lot of shit going on in like early 2010s that I think had a lot of young people being like, there's no way we come out of this alive. Like the world's falling apart. And that was I remember that being an extremely prevalent attitude. I had that attitude, right? Like I remember being an undergrad and just thinking, there's no way this thing lasts. Like it was there just seems to be disaster after disaster. And you have to sort of you have to find arguments about optimism and stuff. It's like the default is pessimism. And then you actually have to discover arguments about like why you should be optimistic and principled reasons to be optimistic.
That's interesting. First thought, but then I have a counter to that thought is, the period between 2000 and 2010 wasn't exactly like roses and sunshine either. Iraq War, Afghanistan, September 11th. However, to understand those arguments and to follow that, you had to get a subscription to the New York Times. You had to read the New Yorker. You had to watch the Fox News or MSNBC. But social media just provides all that news into your face pretty immediately. And as you were speaking, I just looked up when Pinker's Better Angels was published. It was published in 2011. And Ridley's Rational Optimist was published in 2010. And these were published precisely because they were pushing back against the pessimism of the time. So I don't know, you can imagine Pinker and Ridley's pessimism barometer starts tweaking maybe 4 years before the books were written. And they're probably early on the crest of understanding what's happening. So those books probably came out as that pessimist crest was starting to spill over into the period that you're talking about. And then all of this, would just be exacerbated by social media, for sure. I definitely don't want to be misinterpreted as saying social media is just an unallied good. Of course, it has many negative things too, and just the ready availability of news and information will definitely exacerbate that pessimism. So I guess my response would be like, I don't totally disagree. I think that's completely plausible to add into the set of explanations. And that would, I think, just kind of go along with what Haidt is saying, except Haidt is more focused on like beauty standards and stuff and less focused on just the memes at the time. And social media is a great way to spread memes more quickly. So in that way, I could see that more bad news gets in front of younger people more quickly. That leads to Greta, that leads to pessimism, that leads to anxiety and worry and stress and all that. I would say that's offset by the ability to network and to meet people with similar interests and all that. But leaving aside the offset, what you said totally strikes me as absolutely plausible, for sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it explains why it's particularly bad among young people, but it might explain why like just suicide rates in general have sort of been going up. Yeah, I think it's probably worth flagging Martin Gurri's book, The Revolt of the Public here.
I don't know anything about this, so maybe just say the whole thing, just for listeners and myself.
Yeah, I'll just very briefly summarize it. So he wrote this in 2014, maybe. Someone fact check me on that. But basically, the book is claiming that there's sort of this crisis of authority that's been brought about by the digital revolution. So he's not talking about social media in particular, he's just talking about the digitization of everything. And he's not even necessarily putting an optimistic or pessimistic spin on it. He's just pointing out that it's much, much easier now for people in the public to critique and see the flaws in traditional institutions and make those critiques public and have them widely disseminated. And what this leads to is many public movements and protests by people who are very focused on problems but don't have tons of solutions. His sort of main two illustrative examples throughout the book, I think, were Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring. And he basically said these were people that were dissatisfied with the status quo and thought there was just like too much corruption and unfairness, but weren't proposing any concrete policies. They were just showing up and protesting. And I think you could put more modern protest movements in this camp as well. I think, beyond like the claim to abolish the police, like BLM is basically in this camp, right? Where it's just like, let's show up and protest and demand change. What exactly, we're not sure, but we'll protest. And then, environmental or degrowth stuff, I think, is along similar lines, where like the degrowth policy proposal is just like a total non-starter, right? So, and so anyway, he's just pointing out that how the digital revolution sort of increased greased the wheels and enabled people to just come face to face with their dissatisfaction, but and so caused this sort of mass, in some places, this mass unrest that was not coupled to any sort of, they were not brought together by the vision of some solution to a problem. They're brought together by being anxious and scared and afraid about something. And these causes these very like negatively valenced social movements. Anyway, we could, I'm sure, do an entire episode on the book, but I think he's trying to capture precisely this dynamic of like, why did things start to seem incredibly negative sort of around this time?
Yeah. I buy your thesis. I think that's a contributing factor for sure. Let's just do a hard pivot. Let's do a hard pivot to talking about cyberbullying, because I thought that was a nice discussion from Haidt. When Haidt talks about cyberbullying, he talks about it in the context of reasons why girls are particularly vulnerable to social media. Off the bat, what I liked about this discussion is that he didn't shy away from talking about gender differences. That would be an easy move, I think, for social psychologists to do. But this is one particular realm where there are gender differences. And the fact that he didn't shy away from that, I was very impressed by, especially because like we can maybe say the woke fever is breaking, but not when he was writing the book. And it was a pretty impressive thing from him to do, to just talk specifically about the differences here.
Just before you go on, we should say he's been quite good on that subject, I think,
100%.
His career. Like him and Greg Lukianoff wrote The Coddling and the American Mind, calling attention to a lot of this stuff quite early. So I've been quite impressed with him on that.
Absolutely.
On the general social justice type of issues. Yeah.
And this is an example of why making the subjects of gender differences like forbidden and you can't talk about them is so harmful, because there clearly are differences between the way that boys and girls interact with social media. And we definitely need to think about that and study that. And so he gives 4 reasons. I'm just going to kind of summarize them briefly. One is that girls are more affected by visual social comparisons and perfectionism. And so it's totally plausible and strikes me as just like prima facie true that girls on average will be more affected by seeing photos of other girls looking thin and body standards and all that. Of course, that applies to men. I would say just maybe less, but there's definitely body dysmorphia for men as well. So not discrediting that. So that's the first reason why Haidt says that girls are more vulnerable. Second reason is girls' aggression is more relational, which is something that Peterson talks about, and changing his heading just means the ways that girls fight tend to be like mean girls, like gossip, like emotional, like
psychological
stuff.
warfare.
Yeah, psychological stuff. Yeah, that was brought vivid to me. So a friend of mine was in a frat, and I had no idea how fraternities and sororities, like I would never want Georgia to go into a sorority. He said that at the sorority, the first thing that they did is that they took all of the freshmen and they put them in their like broad panties and they just lined them up. And then all the seniors would just go one by one and point out every flaw in each freshman's body, just to give lifelong fucking insecurities for like the rest of their life. Like that shit is so fucked. So girls' aggression is more relational. And so this is what gets to cyberbullying. Cyberbullying has absolutely increased. I would say, like, obviously it's going to increase when you have more social interactions online. And this is a problem. And so let me just quote one thing here, which I have no reason to doubt Haidt's data. I haven't fact checked it, but again, this seems pretty robust from my intuition's perspective. Studies confirm that as adolescents moved their social life online, the nature of bullying began to change. So one systemic review of studies from 1998 to 2017 found a decrease in face-to-face bullying among boys, but an increase among girls, especially among younger adolescent girls. However, cyberbullying among girls surged. According to one major US survey, these high rates of cyberbullying have persisted between 2011 and 2019. Throughout the period, approximately 1 in 10 high school boys and 1 in 5 high school girls experienced cyberbullying each year. In other words, the move online made bullying and harassment a larger part of daily life for girls. So, from my perspective, that is a problem that needs to be addressed through like anti-bullying campaigns, through drawing awareness to what cyberbullying looks like, making it easier to talk to teachers, making it more of a norm that if you observe your friend being bullied, you kind of intervene. All this kind of stuff I'm completely in favor of addressing. What I don't like, though, is using the rates of cyberbullying as a justification for an abolitionist perspective with regards to the technology. And so I want to draw a comparison and tell me what you think about this comparison. So my comparison was to sports injuries. Sports and sports injuries. So let's imagine instead of writing a book called The Anxious Generation, Haidt writes a book called The Injured Generation. And so of the millions of people who play sports, like look this number up, I guess 8.6 million people a year experience like horrible sports injuries. So we're talking like blunt force trauma to the head. We're talking like torn muscles and ligaments. We're talking like broken calves and knees and ankles and arms and shins. And you can imagine Haidt saying, like, imagine just looking at all 8.6 million the injured generation. And if you gather them all into like one room, you would be forgiven for thinking they just came back from like a battle. And then you could write a whole book talking about like just the deleterious effects of like a concussion and the inability to like read and focus based on like the blunt force trauma, which is just so normalized in our society. You could start talking about schools where sports is encouraged, where they focus on like college football. You just look at the grades and the grade standards are collapsing. And so sports is directly related to like a lowered IQ and worse academic performance. You could then start talking about dopamine, and you could start talking about like the addictive nature of sports. Your brain, especially the brains of like young kids, like they're so neuroplastic, right? And it's just like the intensity of sports has to be like ratcheted up. And like sports on the television, they have to just keep intensifying this addictive nature of their content. And the Super Bowl halftime show just has to get more and more stimulation and be able to surge more and more dopamine into these poor, vulnerable kids, right? You could talk about the top big 5 sports companies and how evil these sports companies are, like Adidas and Nike, the worst one of all, like pumping like advertisements into the brains of young okay, you get the point, right? What's this whole thing missing? The whole thing missing is that sports has huge numbers of benefits as well, and that sports brings like a massive amount of value into people's lives. The amount of connections and the sense of purpose and the sense of like athletic achievement is so important to consider also. And so while we can address sports injuries, and while we can like totally acknowledge that like certain things need to change, and maybe, for example, in Canada, there is a change to get rid of fighting in youth hockey leagues. So why am I saying all this? I'm saying this because it's so easy to just cherry pick the negative shit. You could just cherry pick the negative shit, and then you can write hundreds of pages of books talking about neuroplasticity and dopamine and going on and on about just like torn muscles and ligaments and make it super sensationalistic. And in so doing, you get like so into the weeds of like the effect of concussions on like 14-year-olds that you forget to just like zoom out for a sec and just be like, okay, like sports is awesome for the majority of people, and it comes with downsides too. Social media is awesome for the majority of people, and it comes with downsides too. Cyberbullying is a problem. We need to address it. Blunt force trauma is a problem. We need to address it. But we do not need to be like abolitionist about this whole thing and fail to recognize the massive benefits. And the massive benefits are just harder to write about, and they're not as vivid, and they don't stay in your mind as much. And so when I was reading this discussion about cyberbullying, it's very valuable. Just like talking about sports injuries is valuable, but we needn't forget about the massive amounts of benefits. And that was my little attempt at trying to use a different example to show how one can be very rhetorical and is talk about neuroplasticity and young brains and all that, and just forget the massive amounts of benefits as well.
Yeah. I mean, I basically agree. I mean, two things. First is that I think Haidt would want to claim that we had been ignoring a lot of the downsides for a long time, and that someone needs to draw attention to them. So it would be as if no one had run studies yet pointing out that some of the blunt force trauma to the head that NFL players sustain is not a good thing, right? And so we do need to run studies on that. We need to understand what the downsides are so that we can figure out, what form of helmets they need to wear, or, whether we need to make changes to the regulations about how they can hit, or, whatever. So we do need to understand the downside still, right? And so there's still roles for these studies trying to isolate to what extent social media is a cause of decreasing mental health and whatnot. And then, yeah, I mean, I take your point. It's just Haidt, I think, would just say that in the case of social media, the positives just simply don't outweigh the negatives. And so then you just have to have an argument about what the positives are, which I guess, yeah, maybe let's go there. I mean, what do you think the positives are
of social media?
Yeah. Like, what's your case for why it's awesome? Like, so for instance, I don't have Instagram. Convince me why I should be on Instagram. Like, why would it improve my life?
Instagram seems to be the main social media app that when I meet somebody new, they say, not what's your Facebook, not what's your WhatsApp, but what's your Instagram. Instagram in Vancouver is just the media, social media that all of the people that I meet who I want to keep in touch with are using. And in general, that is the value of social media to me. Let's talk about Twitter and X separately. But I think I said this in our first social media episode, but episode 15 for the listeners, if they want to go back many, many years, that there are like friends of mine in Africa who I haven't spoke to in 10 years, who occasionally I'll like their stuff or make a little comment and they'll like my stuff. And the value of just softly keeping in touch with your extended network, I think, is, to me, like the most valuable thing, because all these people I would have lost touch with, and I would have felt weird reaching out, having not spoken to them in 10 years. I would have felt weird to reach out. But like, if for whatever reason Helena and I are ever in South Africa again, like I would totally reach out, and I would reach out precisely because I know what's going on with their lives. I know that my one friend Tracy's gotten married and she has a kid now, and she knows that Helena is probably pregnant because we did a like announcement and stuff. And that is like so valuable to me. It's valuable to be able to just like keep in touch with people who make my life better. Yeah, we could use phone calls, but we just didn't use phone calls for that purpose. You can't softly keep in touch with people. So if you think that networking is valuable just in your professional career, then you must acknowledge the value of networking in your private life as well. And that to me is the core benefit of all social medias. And then we can start talking specifically about the pluses and the minuses of like Twitter and X. So for example, I just made a Threads account. And like the For You page of Threads is basically just like the textual equivalent of Instagram, just like light-hearted little thoughts and stuff. I kind of don't really want Threads for that. I want a battleground. Like Twitter, I want Twitter, and I want like Blue Sky. I want a particular social media I can go to when I want to get into the goddamn octagon, because I want that space. I want to be able to leave that space, but I want to be able to go into that space. And that speaks to the differences between different kinds of social medias. Like I wouldn't want everything to be like Twitter/X, but I wouldn't want there to not be Twitter/X, because for the same reason that I don't want every conversation with every person in my life to be like our conversations, like very like fact checking and like argumentative. I don't want every conversation in my life to be like that, but I definitely want some. And I would be very deprived if I didn't have the ability to really battle with an equal on important things, right? And so that's why I think social media is so amazing. Same reason for networking, and same reason just to talk to other people, talk to other minds, and to be exposed to stuff that you wouldn't really get easily. If the only source of information was like the New York Times and mainstream media and my immediate social circle, I would just be ignorant on 1,000 different topics that I'm not ignorant on, because of social media. And that to me is the major benefit.
Yeah. So I largely agree with you here. I mean, I'm just saying, you're sneaking in. It's just there's a question about how bad are these consequences for kids, right? If Barbies do cause severe body dysmorphia for a relatively high fraction of little girls, then are we going to say, well, just because some girls also enjoy playing with them, it's worth it to have it out there and risk body dysmorphia for a bunch of kids? Like, well, that's, I guess, a public policy question that we have to answer. But I don't think it's sufficient to just say, well, because there are pros and cons, it's always a matter of degree to what extent we should regulate something. We should never ever abolish something. It's like, well, there are also pros and cons to like using cocaine when you're 13, but we've kind of taken the position as a society that just the cons are bad enough to outweigh the pros there, that we sort of prohibit 13-year-olds from using cocaine, right?
I don't think it's either let it happen as it is because there's more pros than cons, or abolish. I think it's let's change the social medias such that we mitigate the negative effects while amplifying the positive effects. And so let's think about all of the various mechanisms that are in social media now to prevent pylons and bullying that likely weren't implemented in 2010 when they first came out. So you can block people, you can mute people. On Twitter, you can prevent people from commenting, you can hide people, you can defriend people. These all, to various degrees, were implemented as certain problems started to arise.
I wasn't saying you were wrong about your claims. I was just saying your analogy is just bundling in the you're bundling in the assumption that the pros, that one, we can introduce sufficient technology such that the pros can outweigh the cons. And I'm just saying that's not always the case, right? Drug use among 13-year-olds, for instance. Like once you bundle in the assumption that there are tons of pros for things, then of course the question becomes like, okay, how do we change the status quo here to try and minimize the cons and increase the pros, and everyone's in that game. I'm just saying people like Haidt just want to say there's not that many pros here and the cons are massive. And, you know, our first episode was just saying, well, you're not actually summoning the evidence you think you're summoning to make that claim about the cons. But I just think you're maybe more provocatively, I don't know. Your thought experiment just strikes me as like somewhat vacuous in some sense. The general claim that you're making, like we always need to think about the pros and cons of things. It's like, yeah, I mean, I think people are. They're just claiming that the cons massively outweigh the pros, such that the most appropriate thing to do right now is to like regulate screen time in schools, I guess, or whatever the most severe proposals are right now.
I think it's as vacuous as to say that it's all about incentives. Everything is about incentives. So when Thomas Sowell talks about incentives, it would be vacuous if he stopped there, but he doesn't stop there. He starts there. So with regards to what I was saying and just my general claim, yeah, it's vacuous to say you got to think about the pros and the cons and then end the conversation. But if we start enumerating like the cons and then the technological improvements to try to mitigate those cons, then I don't think it's vacuous anymore. It's trying to identify what's the problem. Let's just take mass Twitter pylons. Okay, how can we fix that? Well, we can add the mute button, the block button, and the ability to hide comments from people who don't follow you, which I think Pinker does. That is a con and then a resolution, and then you start the conversation again. Yeah. Counter question to you, and maybe to start getting to the third and final act of this 6.5 act play. What did you like about the book? I've kind of talked about some stuff I liked about the book, but what did you like about the book?
I liked the, now I'm forgetting, I think second part, where he just talks about the importance of kids having alone, unobserved time playing with other kids outside of the purview of adults, basically, of kids being able to wander around parks and get lost and make forts and have stick fights with other kids and get in arguments and resolve their own disputes, basically. I don't know to what extent this is decreasing over time. You know, one of the best parts of my childhood was there was a park, the entry to a park like a couple blocks away from me, and I spent half my childhood with other kids in that park. My parents had no idea where I was from after school until 8 p.m. or whenever I had to be home. And there was a lot of like, yeah, I got injured and did stupid things. And I learned a lot about, as you were saying, relating to other kids and how to be social and how to resolve disputes on my own and stuff. And it does scare me to think that those sort of interactions are being prohibited by helicopter parenting, basically. And so I really like that he's drawing attention to the fact that kids need to be able to explore the world on their own and figure out and solve their own problems. And I think, insofar as parents are prohibiting their kids from doing that and trying to protect them from every little thing, I think that is a huge problem, is gonna basically create dysfunctional adults. And I think this might explain some of the attitudes of younger college students, to maybe bring us closer to one of, Haidt's other hobby horses, which is basically the bizarre nature of some of the demands by certain college students that every class be a safe space and all this stuff that everyone's very aware of now. But I think those sort of issues are perhaps sort of one and the same thing. So anyway, yeah, I like that part of the book, and I appreciate that he's started this organization called Let Grow with the aforementioned Peter Gray, trying to encourage parents to just let kids do things on their own. Let them take the bus at age 8 or 9, let them walk to the grocery store, because they like to do it too. Like, kids like to be given responsibilities. Let your older child look after your younger child or walk them to school. And as a non-parent, I endorse his his takes on parenting.
It's so funny that you brought that up, because that was one of the quotes that I showed. So, okay. I totally agree. I definitely want Georgia to go exploring in the neighborhood and go off without her. But I want her to have a fucking phone when she does it, though. I want her to have the ability to call me. And one of the things he says is the following, which is, practice letting your kids out of sight without them having ways to reach you. So while you cook dinner for your friends, send out your kids to the grocery store to pick up more garlic, blah, blah, blah. And you can print off a sign at Let Grow that says, "I'm not lost or neglected," and include your phone number. Helena read that and she said, that is a child protection concern, which is the social work language for, if I ever saw that as a social worker, I would immediately call the department and say that there's something wrong here. I think that the let grow and go walk and go do your thing and explore, as a parent, do it, but just have the ability to call me. And so don't strip away the phone. And also encourage people to go far away, especially in inner cities where we live, where there's a lot of unsavory and slightly sketchy people in our neighborhoods, right? And I just think it's kind of irresponsible to send your kid off, not with a phone, but with a little sign that says, "I'm not neglected," especially if you're talking about 8 to 12-year-olds. So I just thought he kind of got himself into a bit of a trap when he had to advocate both policies simultaneously. And Helena's reaction was hilarious when I showed her that quote. But anyways, yeah.
Yeah, actually, it would be kind of interesting to have Helena on to talk about this, because, I mean, he kind of takes aim at social workers. He says, we're overprotecting kids, and, the fact that someone would call the cops or a social worker on a kid who's just walking to the store alone. And he said he's had that happen to friends. They let their 8-year-old kid walk to the store to buy something, and, Child Protective Services can get involved. And I actually think that's insane. And Helena doesn't, it sounds like. So that could be an interesting just disagreement to explore. So, I mean, this is her job. So you can either take that, it's her job, so she knows what she's talking about and she's an expert here, or you can take that as, well, she's also incentivized to always think of the worst case and be in some sense, her job is to be overprotective of kids, because she's always she's seeing kids constantly in horrible situations. But that her vigilance mechanisms might be too honed, right? Because she's used to seeing kids in danger and stuff.
No, it's just an interesting point that our current cultural situation is that if you see a kid without a parent, the likelihood that that kid is neglected is high, such that it absolutely makes statistical sense to flag any kid walking around, because, quote, responsible parents have a meme in their head that you should never leave your kid out of sight. And it's only the neglectful, irresponsible parents that don't have that meme. So it's a good immediate heuristic. speaking about a world where no one has that meme in their head is kind of what Haidt's trying to do. And I respect the project, but like as a means of getting from A to B, I think allowing your kid to have a phone to call for help if something's going wrong is like totally a responsible thing to do. And so, yeah, maybe in 15, 20 years when kids are all just free range again, we can start getting rid of the phones, but we need to like bridge. And just as a parent, like I wouldn't feel comfortable, George, like I don't feel comfortable not being able to get in touch with Helena at any given point. Like anyone who's in a relationship, would you feel comfortable with your spouse just not having their phone for a couple of weeks? Like we just check in daily. Like I'd like to know where she is.
Well, we're talking about kids. So if one is not a couple of weeks, two, he does advocate giving kids phones that just like, they're just either, they're flip phones or they just have a couple numbers programmed in there.
Sure. Yeah, that's fair.
There are ways to get around this. Like he's not saying they should be cut off. They should be sent out in the desert with no contact with civilization and learn to fend for themselves and fish and hunt. Like this is insane. Like he even advocates, either giving them flip phones or giving them iPhones and stuff with limited apps where they
that's
have
fair.
all these kid-friendly things. Yeah. And so I'm basically fully on his side when it comes to this stuff. So I'll go to bat against you and Helena. Let's go.
Including flip phones or iPhones with safety apps obviates all my concerns. That's fine. It's the concern is like no phone, and the comparison to adults is like I think adults are more capable than taking care of themselves than kids. Controversial opinion, but even an adult who is near and dear to me, a member of my family, I want them to have a phone on them so I can call them when I need to, and I want to know where they are. And that's not being overprotective of Helena. It's just I'd like to know where she is, and she likes to know where I am.
Are you guys one of those couples that shares your location constantly with one another?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, God.
Yeah. Oh, it's convenient. I'm at the park, and she doesn't need to know where I'm at, and she just meets me there. Yeah, we totally share our location. Yeah. What, you don't like that?
I find it so bizarre. It honestly creeps me out. Like, I know tons of my friends do it, and they'll just do it with their friends. But people have like 50 contacts that they can see their location at all time. No, I totally.
Yeah, we do it with our friends too.
This absolutely freaks me out. I think this is extremely bizarre behavior.
Well, where are you going that you don't want people to know?
You'll never know now. Dude.
Yeah. The seedy drug dens and the red light districts of CMU. Yeah. All right, man. Well, maybe that's a good place to leave this subject and move on to other things. I have a migraine from looking at all this data.
I know. Oh, my God.
Yeah, actually, we should summarize. So what's the conclusion? Where are we both at after, let's say, we started researching this shit like months ago, but it's only the last couple of weeks that we've been fully in it. What are the takeaways? If someone is only going to listen to the last 10 minutes of this conversation, what are the major takeaways that we want them to have? That we can say are the results of all this research? How would you summarize?
I would summarize by first pointing out that I'm just extremely annoyed by all the academics who ostensibly are trying to shed light on what's going on here, because I just don't think anyone's doing a very good job, which is sort of mind-blowing. But anyway, so I think, to summarize, I think Haidt's thesis is massively overblown. I think he just basically hasn't shown causation in any robust, significant way, and that's a huge problem for his thesis. So he should stop going on podcasts telling everyone that the case is open and shut as far as causation is concerned. Then we have some other theses. I think people are much too quick to assume that their thesis can explain everything that's going on. I think basically all these theses fail to explain lots of the variance in the data. And so I think probably what's going on is there's some extremely complex web of causes that's causing increases in many countries.
I don't even know if you could say many countries. Like, it seems like some countries have this, but I don't even know if I could say the word many yet.
Yeah, but it seems like... So, okay, I guess what I should have said is, like, I am convinced there's something going on with that needs to be explained. I think there is something that needs to be explained here. I think many of the Anglosphere countries with good data have, among adolescents, increasing rates of self-harm, suicidal ideation, and suicide. And from about 2010... Most of these countries have it through 2010, a steady rise through about 2015, 2016. Some countries after that keep going, like the US. Some countries after that sort of just plateau and fluctuate, like Australia, for example. And so I think there is a phenomenon, and it must be a global phenomenon in some sense, perhaps exacerbated by local changes and stuff in individual countries. But I think there is something in need of explanation here. And so I'm glad people are trying to figure out what it is. I just think none of the explanations yet are very good or explain, especially cross-country variation. I think we're still quite in the dark, to be honest. And I think there's like a lot of work to do here to sort out exactly what's going on. It could be, and, we've shit on Haidt's thesis a lot. So let me just say, it could be that social media is a huge part of the story here, but just the evidence that has been summoned thus far is just bad because this phenomenon is hard to study for various reasons that we've discussed previously. So that's definitely on the table, right? It could just be that the evidence so far is bad, but social media is actually a big cause. So my mind is also open for that, but Haidt should not have written this book.
Nice. Yeah, I sign off on all of that. Maybe I'll just try to summarize at a slightly different level of abstraction, which is like, what should you do as a parent, and how should you think about not only this claim, but the inevitable future claims that will come with new technology. I think as a parent, there's no reason to think that social media is like the majority factor of this spike. It may have a tiny amount for some people sometimes, but the only thing you can really do is run an experiment yourself. Nothing you hear on a podcast or from Haidt or from a study will give you better information than just trying it in your household and undoing it if you see things you don't like. With regards to understanding research like this, it's so easy to succumb to the trap of wanting a single clean explanation to very complex phenomena. I succumb to it. In our middle Patreon conversation, it's easy. So just avoid in general, especially with like diet and health claims, because that's just so goddamn complex and hard to study. That most of the time you will not find an easy gluten causes a wheat belly or blah, blah, blah kinds of stories. So just resist simplifications for complex phenomenon in most cases. And finally, when analyzing these kinds of future claims about the effects of a new technology, let's actually rewind it. Let's talk about like when vaccines first came out. Same kinds of stories there. You absolutely can talk about the few people who have died from a botched measles vaccine and go into like the microscopic details of how bad that is. And when you do that, you've kind of forgotten the larger picture. And so just make sure when you're thinking about this stuff, to just keep the larger picture in mind. Think internally. Does it work with your common sense? Like in your day, does social media make your day much better, much worse? So just run it through common sense filters as well. And don't forget to keep the benefits in mind too, because they can often fall out of the conversation when thinking about the negatives. And so that would be my high level takeaways there.
One final thing actually is just that I do have sympathy with parents who are concerned about this problem, because I can appreciate that if you're the parent of a teenage girl and all her friends get Instagram and TikTok, and you're worried that this is not going to be good for your particular daughter, I can understand that you're kind of in a bind there. Like once all her friends have it, what are the odds that you can hold out? Because you're just going to create this total adversarial relationship with your daughter if you tell her like she can't have a phone, or she can't have a phone with social media. And so I think, it is a bit harder than just run an experiment and undo it if you see the negative effects, because there's all these other social pressures coming from her friend group and stuff. And so, I'm not sure, I don't have a clean and easy answer there, but I do totally have sympathy with parents. And I do recognize that there is a bit of a tragedy of the commons element with this problem, insofar as you think it's a problem.
Yeah, I know we're winding down, but it's just when Georgia gets to 14 or whatever, I'm not going to enforce the strong rule, but I am going to tell her my entire thought process as to why I would consider this rule in the first place. So just explain to her, because 14-year-olds are not idiots. They're smart. Like, here's why I'm worried as a parent. I'm worried that you're going to focus too much on Instagram and you're going to neglect your schoolwork. I'm worried that you're going to see all these selective things. There's cyberbullying, and like these are real dangers. And if you want to join social media, like know that this is possible. And if it happens, like let's talk about it and let's figure out how to address it. But I think just open sourcing your thought process to your kid is far more helpful than closed sourcing it and coming up with your rule and then never fucking changing your mind. Because if you change your mind and you let go of this rule, you've demonstrated to your kid that you are not someone who will stand by their word, and you just trap yourself, right? So telling your children why you are coming up with the rule in the first place and just having a conversation with them, I think is how I'm personally going to approach that dilemma. Just get their feedback on why I'm worried about it. Again, point taken that it's hard to just undo. I was thinking when I said that, I was thinking more about like a 4-year-old with an iPad, and it's more difficult when you're talking about social networks and stuff. Yeah, and don't forget, she has a lot of information that I don't have, such as the nuances of social dynamics in her friend group, right? And that information is as valuable as anything that Haidt has said, and cannot be neglected. And if she's telling me that not going on social media is like depriving her of like going to this trip that like all the popular people at school were going to go on, and she's missed out on a lot of things, like that's so important. And so she has just as much valuable information that needs to be listened to as any social psychologist. I wouldn't want to neglect myself from what she has to say as well. These conversations are not unidirectional wisdom to student. It's bidirectional, and she has as much to teach me about why she wants to use social media as I hopefully have to teach her about the negative downsides. Yeah. Well, hopefully that's the last thing we say about this. Like Mr. Hugo Mercier is coming on the pod in a couple weeks, so that'll be a fun conversation. Cool. To be continued, my friend.